unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. Rasputin, Lucifer, evil genius, sombre porcupine, the world's most hated diplomat. These are just some of the choice names that people have given for the former diplomat and politician V.K. Krishna Menon. Menon is in many ways one of the most consequential figures in post-independence India, and he's the subject of a new book by the politician and author Jairam Ramesh titled A Chequered Brilliance, The Many Lives of V.K. Krishna Menon. The book was recently named the co-winner of the 2020 Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay-New India Foundation Book Prize. Jairam Ramesh is a Rajya Sabha MP, former union minister, and author of several well-known books, including Intertwined Lives, P.N. Huxer, and Indira Gandhi. I am pleased to welcome him to the podcast for the very first time. Jairam, welcome to the show and congratulations on the recent prize.
Thank you. Good morning, Milan. Good evening from here. Good morning to you.
Great to speak with you. I want to jump right in by asking you to reflect a bit on the process of doing this book. You know, anyone who reads this quite lengthy book is struck right off the bat by the copious amount of archival material you unearth to piece together the story of, what is a pretty complicated life, I think it's fair to say. You mentioned you took advantage of several new archives which had opened up and given access. Tell us a bit more about how you went about researching this book.
Well, Milan, this is my third biography. And the philosophy that I have followed in all the three biographies is to depend exclusively on archival material. There is very little oral history. There's very little interviewing. There's very little, judgments of others or even of the author. So it is really archival narratives. And this is archives, contemporary written material, which is available in archives in India and abroad as well. Now, specifically on the Krishna Menon biography, after almost 40 years, his archives have been opened up at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, and they really, they are a treasure trove. That's to make an understatement, because they're literally almost 1,000 files. And they've finally been opened up. So I didn't have any special access to it. It was access anybody could have into. Plus, there was a lot of material available on Krishna Menon in archives in the US and UK, which have become now come into the public domain. They've been digitized, and they're now easily accessible. Books have been written on Krishna Menon in the past, but they've either been hagiographies or they've been, hatchet jobs. Because he's a man who evokes extreme views. You're either a great admirer of his or you're, a great critic of his. And I wanted to avoid that, as I have in my previous biographies as well. So frankly, my philosophy on biography writing, Milan, is depend on archives, depend on your own narrative, don't get into psychohistory, don't get into too much of judgments, but present the facts as they reveal themselves in the contemporary written evidence, and let the subject of the biography speak for himself or herself. And that's the approach I've adopted. And the main archives, of course, are the Nehru Memorial Archives for Krishna Menon, then the British National Archives, certainly, and a number of the Eisenhower archives have been very helpful. The John Foster Dulles archives, and the Mountbatten archives in the UK, and a lot of other archives of individuals who had been associated with Krishna Menon in the 40s and the 50s. So it's it's a lot of archival scavenging that's there in the book.
So I want to ask you about this issue of judgment, right? I mean, you note at the outset of the book that it's not meant to be a judgmental undertaking. It is, in your words, a straightforward narrative biography. As you alluded to, however, anyone who ever came in contact with Menon ended up leaving with an extremely strong opinion, sometimes positive, more often than not negative. Was it a struggle as you were doing this to keep your own views in check while you were writing the book?
Well, it's always difficult, Milan. You won't start a book unless you have some modicum of admiration for the subject. And if you don't feel that the subject is worth writing about, you won't start on a biography. Now, I'm not a Menon phobe, but I'm not a Menon file either. So I've presented all the evidence to show that Menon made very major contributions. For example, one of the issues that is very contemporary in India today is self-reliance in the defense manufacturing. He was the greatest champion of that, and he was the only Indian politician in the 50s arguing for a negotiated settlement with China on the border issue, an issue that is uppermost in people's minds today. I present the evidence on that. On the other hand, he was cantankerous. He was. I mean, you called him a diplomat, but he was actually the most undiplomatic diplomat you could think of. He made friends easily, but he made enemies even more easily, and he gave India a bad name in international forums, particularly towards the later part of the 1950s. And the Americans found him pesky, the Britishers found him pesky, the Europeans found him pesky. Um, yeah, I mean, I didn't suppress anything, Milan. There was only one issue that bothered me, and that was a letter that Nehru writes to Krishna Menon in 1939, saying that not only am I in a state of physical collapse, but I'm in a state of great mental tension, and I don't know how I'm going to continue life. And it's a very anguished letter that Nehru writes to Krishna Menon, and I knew. I mean, from the letter, the context was Indira Gandhi's news to her father that she wanted to marry Firoz Gandhi, and that was had really disturbed Nehru, and he shared that anguish with Menon, and that's the only time when I asked, should I include this or should I not include it? But I included it, including my sort of narrative, which says why Nehru was disturbed, and the only person he could share his anguish was with Krishna Menon. So, but I didn't hold back anything. There were suicide notes that he wrote, on numerous occasions, which I have reproduced in the book. Conversations with Chow and Lai, which in today's context, may sound a bit sensitive, so to speak, because here was Krishna Menon arguing for a negotiated settlement. But I included all that, Milan. The author has to have a sense of detachment. I mean, you're attached to the subject, but you can't be detached from the evidence, whether
Right.
it's positive or whether it's negative. And I think intellectual honesty and integrity demands that you present whatever you have found, and provide the narrative, whether it's positive or negative. Because you see, I'm not out to deify him. I'm not out to demonize him either. I'm just saying here is a consequential personality in Indian political life, and this is his life story, warts and all. And I think that's the general approach to biography that I've taken, whether it is in the case of Mr. Huxer or even in the case of Indira Gandhi. Although my biography of Indira Gandhi was on her environmental legacy, but still, I located that environmental legacy in her larger political scheme of things. And as you know, Indira Gandhi is very controversial. She has her legion of admirers, and but she's also got an army of critics. Most importantly, for the emergency that she imposed from 75 to 77. And I couldn't not write about the emergency, in that book, and how she dealt with environmental issues during the emergency.
You know, you've talked a little bit about Menon's personality. There are several telling anecdotes in the book. One comes from Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, Nehru's sister, who would succeed Menon as High Commissioner to London. She once said that he was a, quote, brilliant and versatile man, but he had overpowering ambition, which he sometimes tried to hide under a cloak of pseudo humility. He was like a Victorian woman, a person of moods and periods of depression. The daughter of the last Viceroy of India, Lord Mountbatten, records that Menon was, quote, in a manner far more English than any Englishman, end quote. What did she mean by that? How was he more English than any Englishman?
Well, both Nehru and Milan, were proud Indians, but they were good Britishers as well. Nehru told Mountbatten that Nehru is the last Britisher to rule India. I mean, he said it obviously in a light way, but both of them were very British. They were educated in England. They had British friends. They were part of the British left circle, the Labour Party circle. So Menon, of course, lived in the UK from 1924 till 1952 for 28 years, although Nehru was there in England only for 7 years. Krishna Menon, 28 years when you live in England, and he was student at LSE for 10 years, the longest record that is unlikely to be equal
Right.
remotely. 10 years he was a student at LSE. So he was British in that sense. He was comfortable with Pax Britannica. He was not comfortable with Pax Americana. He
Right.
would have lived with Pax Britannica, but he was certainly very uncomfortable. He had all the suspicions of America, which the British intelligentsia coming from the left had. But coming to what Vijayalakshmi Pandit had said, Milan, you see, in the 1950s, Menon was known as Formula Menon. You had a crisis. You didn't like Menon, but you went to him for a formula. In 1952, it was Menon's formula that led to the armistice in Korea in mid of 1953. And his role in Korea is deeply, deeply significant. Whether it was Cyprus, whether it was Algeria, whether it was Suez, the Suez crisis of 1956, Menon had a formula. And usually Menon's formula clicked. The Americans didn't like it. The Russians didn't like him either, although he was seen to be a Russian agent. And in 1955, Milan, which was perhaps his most glorious year, he almost brought about a rapprochement between the US and China. What Kissinger accomplished in 1971, Menon almost pulled off in 1955. He had 6 meetings with Dulles. He had 2 meetings with Eisenhower, on the issue of imprisoned American airmen, and 4 airmen were actually released because of Menon's intervention. And in 55, unfortunately, the domestic politics of America, Eisenhower was not bold enough to do what Nixon did in 1971. So Menon had, if he wanted to be constructive, he could be very, very constructive. Lester Pearson wrote in his diary, the former Prime Minister of Canada, who was dealing with Menon on the Korean issue, saying that if he wants to be constructive and positive, there is no force like Menon. But you had to wait for those moments
Right.
when he was constructive and positive. He was a very prickly man. And I think the reason why he was prickly, Milan, apart from his personality and so on. Also, the fact, remember, this was an Anglo-Saxon world. We're
Right.
talking of the early 50s. The white man was still ruling the world, and the white man was telling the world what is good for them. And Krishna Menon, thought that he could speak English better than all the guys. He knew more about, the West than many people in the West. So he resented, being talked down to or talked at, and he wanted a position of equality. But in the 50s, it was a different ball game, as you know. The British and the American rule was still the hegemony, the intellectual hegemony, if not the colonial legacy, but certainly the intellectual hegemony was very much there. So Menon spoke freely at the UN. And in the early 50s and till the mid 50s, I think he was a voice that was listened to. The West didn't like him because there were two issues, Milan. One was decolonization in Africa and the apartheid rule in South Africa, on which he was an early bird, and disarmament. He was one of the earliest voices on disarmament, which ultimately, led to the 1963 partial test ban treaty between the U.S. And the USSR. So I think, the environment in the 50s uh, was such that anybody who stood up and got counted from the so-called third world would become a target of attack.
One of the central relationships throughout your book is the friendship, sometimes strained, between Menon and Nehru. Nehru's biographer had this to say about Nehru's 1935 trip to London. He said, quote, "The most lasting impression on Nehru was made not by any Englishman, but by Krishna Menon, who he then met for the first time." Later in the book, you write that during the 17 years or so that Nehru was prime minister, the only person with whom he shared uninhibited intellectual camaraderie was Krishna Menon. Now, on the surface of it, these men had some similarities, but also a great many differences. What was ultimately, do you think, the source of their kind of mutual attraction?
Well, I think, Menon was Nehru's soulmate, and he was a sounding board. And there are many facets to this. Menon was one of the founders of Pelican Books. He was a publisher. He was a well-known publisher. He published a lot of books. He was the founder of the Pelican Books as part of the Penguin, family. He helped in publishing Nehru's books in England, and through which Nehru became an internationally known figure. He was also very close to the British Labour Party, Stafford Cripps, Clement Attlee, Harold Lasky. These were all people who were very influential in the Labour Party. And they were people who Nehru, of course, was known to them, but Menon became a sort of a facilitator and a conduit between Nehru and the left intelligentsia in England. But I think Nehru saw Menon as an international figure. He saw him as a very well read figure, as a very articulate figure. Most Indian politicians Nehru saw were provincial, they were worried about their constituency, worried about their caste, or they were, worried about the communal issue, which was very important at that point of time. And Nehru saw Menon as a kindred spirit. They were democratic socialists. Both were democratic socialists, deep believers in democracy, but unrepentant socialists till the very end. And there were many things on which their views converged. For example, the idea of having a constituent assembly, which Gandhi opposed till 1939, and Gandhi comes around only in 1939. And Nehru and Menon were amongst the earliest people to advocate the idea of a constituent assembly and go way back in 1933, 1934. And as you know, the constituent assembly becomes a reality in 1946, and it leads to the Constitution of India. So it's a it's a phenomenal relationship, because Nehru protects Krishna Menon. He is not blind to Krishna Menon's faults and foibles and weaknesses, but he thinks that the advantage of having Krishna Menon outweighs the disadvantages, and which can be overcome because of Nehru's personality. So I think, frankly, it's the international perspective that Krishna Menon brought, to India's freedom struggle, and the fact that he was one of the key negotiators between India and the British Labour Party. See, most Indians believe that the Indian freedom movement was fought in India. Of course, that's true. But there is another strand to the Indian freedom movement, that there was a strand of negotiation between the Indian National Congress and the British Labour Party. And Menon was a central figure in that process of negotiation.
In contrast to Menon's close partnership with Nehru, you also write that Menon could never quite get his head around Gandhi. At one point he tells Nehru he can't understand Gandhi or the positions that he took. Why did Gandhi remain such an enigma in some sense to Menon?
Well, Gandhi remained an enigma to many people.
To many people.
Menon only articulated his sense of puzzlement at how Gandhi was able to pull it off. Gandhi was not a charismatic speaker. Gandhi was not a charismatic, looker. And Menon's ideas on Menon felt that Gandhi was deeply anti-science, deeply anti-modernity, deeply wedded to, he brought Hindu themes and Hindu motives into the political discourse in India. He defended the caste system. He was absolutely against untouchability, but he defended the caste system, not the caste system. He defended the varnashrama dharma, which is the different gradations. So it was he saw Nehru representing progressive, secular, and by secular he meant absolute separation of religion, that the state had no business in propagating religion. Of course, India is a religious society. However, his notion and Nehru's notion of secular India was that the state is absolutely far away from religion. So and Gandhi was comfortable, with using Hindu themes, Hindu motives. So I think this was a perpetual sense of puzzlement. But Nehru understood Gandhi beautifully, as he wrote to Menon, as some of the letters, that you will never understand Gandhi. You have to go beyond what Gandhi is saying, or go beyond what Gandhi is writing. And I think, for example, I think Menon could never understand how the salt satyagraha, could be such a game changer and a transformative moment in Indian political history. Many people were befuddled by the fact that Gandhi had used salt as a symbol. But that was Gandhi. I think Menon, uh, much later, 30 years later, after, when he was in retirement, began, I think, to appreciate Gandhi much more. But as long as he was out of India, Gandhi to him was a perpetual source of agony. Because Gandhi, what Gandhi said could be interpreted in multiple ways, right? So that's, I think, the reason why he could never relate to Gandhi.
So, Menon left India in 1924. I think he came back once in 1932. He made a second visit in 1946. And this was really a crucial visit because he played a very important role behind the scenes just prior to independence it was in July 1947 that he was appointed India's first High Commissioner to London, when Edwina Mountbatten, the wife, of course, of the Viceroy, wrote in her farewell letter to him, she talked about his friendship, his wise counsel, his judgment, his ability to smooth things over as the British were exiting India. Tell us a little bit about the kind of behind-the-scenes role that Menon played in the final months of the Raj.
Well, in 46, 47, it's a tale of two Menons, Milan. Sardar Patel's chief advisor was V.P. Menon,
Right.
and Jawaharlal Nehru's key advisor was V.K. Krishna Menon. So, in many ways, if you want to write the story of 1946 and 47, it should be called A Tale of Two Menons.
Maybe that's your next book, Jairam.
And the two Menons hated each other, they were as different as, they're completely different. But VP Menon ultimately was the man who came up with the formula for the partition and the transfer of power from the British to the two dominions of India and Pakistan. But right through this period of 46 and 47, but particularly after Mountbatten comes. Mountbatten comes in March of 1947. Less so during Wavell's time, but more when Mountbatten comes, because Krishna Menon has known Edwina from 1934 onwards, and he's met Mountbatten in 1942. He knows Mountbatten. So the Mountbattens, use him not only as Krishna Menon, but also as somebody who enjoys Nehru's confidence and trust. And he's at Nehru's side throughout, from March of 1947 till the 3rd of June, when partition is actually formally announced by the British. And a lot of things that, this is now part of the archival record. It's part of the transfer of power documents as well. Wavell hated Krishna Menon, but Mountbatten depended on him. And I think the dependence, Milan, was to use him as a sounding board, to use him as some sort of as a touchstone of how Nehru would think and what Nehru would do. Because in these matters, I think Krishna Menon and Nehru thought alike. But it really, the two Menons play a very, very, very crucial role. On Kashmir, particularly, Krishna Menon saw Kashmir. He saw Kashmir as part of he saw partition as part of some British strategic, vision for retaining a hold in this part of Asia. And he kept telling Nehru that Kashmir is not just, an issue of integration of one part into India, but it's part of a larger British and Anglo-Saxon American game plan with strategic objectives in order to gain a foothold to deal with Russia and to deal with the Middle East.
So could I ask you about just one aspect of this? Because, many historians have portrayed the debate over partition as a kind of duel between Nehru and Jinnah, with, of course, Mountbatten as a third critical actor. But Congress leader Maulana Azad, in his memoir, and you document this, accuses Menon of being the one responsible for convincing Nehru to accept partition. So, in your judgment, based on everything you've seen, how much of the partition decision can be fairly attributed to Menon's role?
No, I think, to be fair, Milan, the evidence shows that from September of 1946, both Patel and Nehru were beginning to get reconciled to the idea of partition. See, their experience of running the interim government and the problems that they had with Liaquat Ali Khan, and then subsequently the walking out of the Muslim League, I think from September 46 onwards, things become actually even from April 1946, the Calcutta killings, and then subsequently, the way the interim government functioned or made not to function. Uh, by end of 1946, I'm beginning from what I have read of Patel and Nehru. Both Patel and Nehru are beginning to think that this is not in the realm of impossibility. So I would not attribute the decision like Azad said that it was because of. In fact, Azad blames two people. He blames Krishna Menon and he blames Edwina. And I think he is a bit unfair. He was a bitter man when he wrote those 30 pages. He was a bit unfair. I think both Nehru and Patel had basically reconciled themselves that partition was going to be inevitable. That Punjab had to be partitioned, Bengal had to be partitioned in order for to save India. Remember, Milan, one factor that often historians don't talk about is that the British were quite comfortable in transferring power to three entities: the Dominion of India, the Dominion of Pakistan, and there was a third entity, which is a confederation of the princely states. And this was an idea that was being canvassed by the Chamber of Princes in India, and it had its supporters in England. Winston Churchill, although Winston Churchill was not in the government, but he was an important voice in the British political establishment. So, actually, one of Menon's great contributions in England was to knock this idea of a confederacy out of the window, saying that if there's going to be transfer of power, it has to be transfer of power only to two dominions, India and Pakistan, not the confederation of princes. An idea that many people in India, particularly the Chamber of Princes, and incidentally, it's not just the Nawab of Bhopal, but there was the Maharaja of Jodhpur, there was the Maharaja of Travancore. So it transcended the Hindu-Muslim divide. You had the Nizam of Hyderabad and the Nizam of Bhopal, and also the Maharaja of Travancore and the Maharaja of Jodhpur, and a lot of smaller other Maharajas. So, that was, I think, Menon's important role. That he played an important, and there VP Menon also was very, very clear that there must be two dominions. There must be India and there must be Pakistan. There is no place for a third player.
You mentioned Kashmir earlier, and I want to circle back to that. Fast forward a few years, Menon becomes ambassador to the United Nations. He makes this famous 8+ hour impassioned defense of India's position on Kashmir in front of the United Nations Security Council. This earned him a spot, as you note, in the Guinness Book of World Records because of the length of his intervention. But you also note that this made him a hero back home. What was it about this speech that sort of captured the imaginations of Indians and would become, I think, a central part of his legacy going forward?
It was a grand theatrical performance. The fact that in between two parts of his speech, he fainted, and he was revived, and the fact that he spoke that long, and he that was the first time since 1948 that India's case was made with such eloquence and with such level of detail, and with such political, slant which Krishna Menon made. And as you know, Milan, that made him a hero in India. And even his who were to become his bitter political rivals later, most importantly, Rajagopalachari, made a public appeal that he should win. He was contesting the Bombay elections then, the 1957 election, and there was a public appeal made that in the national interest, Krishna Menon should win. Although that 5 years later, the same Rajaji would say, in the national interest, Krishna Menon should go.
Should lose.
In the context of of the Chinese. But Milan, more than Kashmir, I want to say one word on China,
Please.
because that's very, very, very topical, very, very relevant.
Correct.
Krishna Menon, and there is a lot of evidence that I've brought out, which has now become available, including the transcript of his conversations with Chou En-lai in April of 1960. Krishna Menon was one politician, the only man who was arguing for a negotiated settlement. Now, what the contours of this negotiated settlement were was not very clear. At some places, it was called a swap deal. That we swap. That we allow the Chinese suzerainty in areas which today are contested, namely Ladakh, whereas the Chinese acknowledged India's case in the eastern sector. Broadly, that's what the swap deal meant. There was sometimes the word lease was used, sometimes the word suzerainty was used, but uh, whatever it was a negotiated settlement that Krishna Menon was talking about and advocating from 1958 onwards. But unfortunately, the Nehru's cabinet was very badly divided on this. Only Krishna Menon and some other people belonging to the left were supporting a negotiated settlement, and all of Nehru's big guns in the cabinet, the Home Minister Govind Vallabh Pant, the Finance Minister Morarji Desai, and of course the Vice President Dr. Radhakrishnan, were all against it. And Nehru, from 58 onwards, Nehru is the autumn of the patriarch. Nehru is in a period of his political decline after 1958. It's a slow decline, and he's not the same Nehru, who could say, "No, guys, I want a negotiated settlement." Parliament was against a negotiated settlement. The socialists were against a negotiated settlement, and a young MP, a 37-year-old MP who had just been elected from UP, was the most eloquent voice against any negotiated settlement on the Chinese border. Of course, that MP in 2003 goes to Beijing as prime minister and signs an agreement with his counterpart saying that we must have a negotiated settlement. And they appoint special representatives. I'm, of course, talking of Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Parliament was against a negotiated settlement. The Indian media was against a negotiated settlement. Nehru's cabinet was against a negotiated settlement. Nehru was ambivalent. He never came out strongly in favor of Menon, and that. Remember, Chou En-lai comes to India. He comes to India in 55. He comes to India in 56. He comes to India in 57, and then he comes to India in 1960. And he's in India for 6 days in 1960, in April of 1960. And that's the last opportunity for a negotiated settlement. In July of 1962, Krishna Menon talks to Chen Yi in Geneva. And there again, there's talk of a negotiated settlement, but by then it's too late.
A few years later, Menon would end up, of course, famously resigning his position as defense minister over China's 1962 invasion of India. You document the ways in which he had poisoned, I guess you could say, relations between the civilian establishment and the three military service chiefs. In retrospect, and with the benefit of hindsight, do you think sort of Menon was a convenient fall guy, or do you think one can kind of draw a direct sort of causal linkage from Menon's behavior to the debacle India suffered at the hands of the Chinese in the 62 war?
Two things, Milan. He was a fall guy. If he didn't go, Nehru would have had to resign. The Congress party, the MPs of the Congress party said, either you go, if Menon doesn't go, you go. They demanded Menon's resignation. So Menon resigns, on the 7th of November, finally. Nehru is very reluctant to accept the resignation. He's holding on to the resignation letter from the 28th of October, 1962 to the 7th of November 1962. But in a meeting of Congress members of Parliament, many Congress MPs say that, look, you got to fire him. If you don't fire him, you'll have to go. And so I think he became, to that extent, he became a fall guy, right? But at the same time, it's very clear that the Americans had read the Riot Act to the Indians and said, as long as Menon is defense minister, no military supply will come from America. Now, that meant no military supply from Canada. That meant no military supply from Britain. And this is very clear. Kennedy passes this message on to B.K. Nehru, who was our ambassador, and Galbraith passes this message on to Nehru in Delhi. So, in a way, Nehru was boxed in. He knew that he needed the military supplies. There was a pause, as you know. The Chinese first attack on the 20th of October 1962. This goes on till the 28th of October. There is a pause, and then again it starts on the 14th or 15th of November 1962, and it goes on for another 8-9 days. So in that interregnum, the negotiations were taking place for arms supply. And it's very clear that the price for the arms supply was the exit of Menon. So Nehru had to get rid of him. There's no question about it. He had to get rid of him to deal with domestic political opinion. He had to get rid of him to satisfy the Americans. And this was a price that he had to pay for getting military supplies immediately. Whether that means that he was a fall guy, yeah, I mean, he was a bit of a fall guy, but he had vitiated the atmosphere. He had played favorites. The appointment of General Call, who had absolutely no field experience and who was more of a military administrator rather than a field commander, led to very severe losses for India in Nefa, which is today's Arunachal Pradesh. So there were some disastrous decisions that he had taken. But I think the more important reason why he had to go was the two factors that I mentioned, which is that Nehru had to appease the Congress party and Nehru had to appease the Americans. This was the price that India had to. Menon's departure had, Nehru's position was saved and strengthened domestically, and American military supply, and British military supply, and Canadian military supply was facilitated once Menon was out of the scene.
So, Jairam, I want to sort of end this conversation by asking you to kind of reflect on the bigger picture. There's a new generation of Indians who are young, who may not know the name Krishna Menon, right? They're familiar with Nehru, with Gandhi, with Mountbatten. What is it that you hope that they take away from this book as they try to position Menon in the sort of pantheon, right? As you think about the kind of sweep of the 20th century. What is it that you think his legacy should be, and that is deserving of a further study and further inquiry?
Well, I think one of his great contributions to India, which is still very relevant and which is still being talked about, is his whole emphasis on, building a domestic defense production capability. He was the man who favored MiG production in India over British and American aircraft because the Soviets were willing to India to manufacture those aircraft in India. This is Atmanirbhar Bharat of Narendra Modi. He was an early advocate and practitioner. He didn't call it Atmanirbhar, he called it self-reliance. But Atmanirbhar means self-reliance. So, and this whole emphasis on defense research, he was the one who got the Defense Research and Development Organization going. So that's one part of his legacy, which I think continues to be very, very important. I think the fact that he was a voice, always looking for an independent voice. Whether he never, I mean, he used the word non-alignment, but what he meant by non-alignment basically was that India should do a cold calculus of its interests, and it should emerge as an independent voice. And I think that's a legacy that is still very much very much important. um, his uh, he was he was a democratic socialist, as I mentioned, a great believer in democracy. He would have opposed the emergency, undoubtedly, but I'm not so sure that he would have embraced liberalization. I think he was, as I said, a democratic socialist. They were two sides of the same coin. Now, one could argue that the socialist legacy has lost its luster, but the issues surrounding the legacy over democracy, is still very, very important. Uh, and I think, Milan, frankly, n- the manner in which he conducted himself after he exited enhanced his stature in Indian public life. He left with dignity, he left with a sense of quietude, and demonstrated remarkable loyalty to a man who you could argue had sacrificed him, at a crucial time. But yet there was no bitterness. And I think that's an important lesson for everybody in public life. He wrote no memoir. There was no, there was no,
There was no
attempt,
tell-all book.
no kiss and tell all book. There was no attempt to justify himself. So, the manner in which he conducted himself after, we judge public personalities by what they do when they are in power. I believe it's important to judge public personalities by how they conduct themselves when they're out of power. And whether it was P.N. Huxer, who was Indira Gandhi's alter ego for 5 years before he was, shunted aside, or whether it was Krishna Menon, who was Nehru's soulmate for 25 years before he too was, sort of kept aside. Both these gentlemen showed remarkable dignity when they were out of office. And I think that's equally an important yardstick for judging public personalities, other than what they achieve when they are in power.
My guest on the show today is Jairam Ramesh. His new book is called Chequered Brilliance, The Many Lives of V.K. Krishna Menon. The book was recently named the co-winner of the 2020 Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay-New India Foundation Book Prize. It is a fabulous read. It gives fodder for many more books, I think, Jairam, on this period, on Menon, on the two Menons, perhaps. Thank you for taking the time, and congratulations on the achievement.
Thank you, Milan. Thank you. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest-growing podcasting producing platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Jonathan Kay. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Maya Krishna Rogers is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.